Speaker view, I suppose. Huh?
Great. That's great. All right. We might make a start if that's all right. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you all here. Welcome to visitors that are from outside CHC. Welcome to CHC faculty and staff. It's great for you all to be here. This is a faculty meeting for some of you, and it's a Millis Institute research event for all of you. This is the first one for 2021. The Millis Institute's gradually being morphed and refocused into a Centre for Christian Thought and Christian Scholarship. And so this is the first of a few research events that we have planned this year. So thanks for coming along. As you'll see, you've got COVID-safe snacks. Sorry for those of you who are online, you don't have those unless you've got your own. But thanks to Steve Beaumont and Izoza for organising those. And this is an exciting event because we're launching a book today. For those of you who are online, there it is. It's a real thing. There you go. This is the book edited by Johannes Lutz, our own Johannes Lutz, and Beth Green, who, by the way, has joined us from Canada online. It's midnight over there at the moment. Is that right, Beth? So thank you for checking in, even though it's a shocking time of day to be doing anything, really. Innovating Christian education research, which I know that a number of CHC faculty also contributed to. So it's not just Johannes and Beth involved, but there are many authors and editors, many authors who've contributed chapters, many CHC faculty, as well as other Christian higher ed institutions as well. So it's great to celebrate the publication of this book. I'm going to hand over to Johannes to lead us off, and then we're going to hear from a number of chapter authors. There'll be some time for Q&A and reflection partway through, and then Beth and Johannes will finish this off as well. So over to you, Johannes.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And warm welcome to you joining online, and wonderful to be here and to be able to launch the book. The book, as you would know, came out of the CHIA conference that was held in 2019. And just to provide a little bit of context, we had a total of 50 contributions that were presented at the CHIA conference from colleagues affiliated with universities and Christian colleges and seminaries in Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Canada, Zambia, and the United States of America. So in total, we have had 50 contributions presented by people affiliated with more than 40 institutions. So that's what we had at the conference. However, the publishers were very clear with us as the editors, as we were discussing with them our intention to publish a book, that they were not going to consider a conference proceedings. What they wanted was a carefully curated selection of chapters. And so that sent us off on a journey that involved probably the most rigorous peer review I've ever been involved with any edited book, where we had multiple layers of peer review involving both the book manuscript itself, which was blind peer reviewed, then the chapters that were subjected to editor coordinated peer review, then there was a publisher coordinated peer review process, blind peer review added at the end. And so what we ultimately were left with was 23 chapters, which we are going to introduce very briefly in a moment to you. For me personally, it was a very big privilege to be editing this book together with you, Beth, an enormous privilege. And just as I begin to introduce Beth, most of you know her, but for the few of you who haven't perhaps come across her before, she is Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Tyndale University in Toronto. Dr. Green is a Fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and a Senior Fellow at the faith-based think tank Cardis. She has a doctorate from the University of Oxford, where else, and is also a graduate of Cambridge and London universities. And I could go illustrious. And we've got a bit of stuff in Zambia. You know how to manage that topic. Newton, I think. Do we know where we can?
You can talk stuff around with that.
Okay. So anyway, it was a real privilege, Beth, to be editing this book with you. And now over to you, Beth. What can you tell us about the book? Can you give us a run through the book?
Thank you, Johannes. And I just want to say, likewise, it was a pleasure to work with you. The concept for the book was Johannes's concept. So I'm delighted to him for having that vision, indebted to him, I should say, for having that vision. I'm going to take you through the chapters in a bit of a whistle-stop tour. It's a bit embarrassing because taking them in order, I have to begin after the introduction with my own chapter, which many of you have heard already as the keynote at the symposium. And I thought I would get into more trouble than I did for my chapter, because in my chapter, Present Tense, Christian Education in Secular Time, I was just positing some distinctions that I thought might help Christian institutions of higher education reimagine their vocation. So I was suggesting that we might like to think about using the concept of imagination rather than worldview. And I know worldview is very tightly held onto still by many of us. I posited that we might like to think about pedagogy rather than curriculum, and to talk about a distinctively rather than uniquely Christian vision. If I move on to chapter 3, Thinking as Christian Virtue, Reason and Persuasion for a Fractious Age, Mark Stevens gave us, it was a prize-winning chapter at the symposium, but a wonderful extension, I guess is the best way of putting it, of the work of Alan Jacobs on enabling people to disagree charitably, to avoid stereotyping and caricature, and to foster virtuous conversations in which people persuade rather than dominate. And I think that focus on virtuous conversation is just so timely at the moment in our current contexts. In chapter 4, Darren Island took us home. His chapter on homecoming, restoring a theology of place within Christian education, posits that our institutions of Christian learning should be person-forming communities, and that we ought to explore the principles of placemaking in Christian education. Chapter 5, Christian higher education, capturing a personal, passionate profession. So Beverly Norsworthy drew on a case study from of Christian education, from her own work of developing this notion within the profession of the personal, passionate approaches, and how the expression of God's redemptive work in our practice of Christian education might be the mirror in which we learn some more about our own vocation in bringing the kingdom of God into our institutional lives. In chapter 6, Elizabeth Beech, her chapter, I should say, was called Towards a Conceptual Model for Biblical Transformative Online Learning. How prophetic was it to tackle online learning just the year before we were all shoved into this space? But she was looking at the problem that little research or reflection had considered how to provide online education that's effective and transformative, and she was positing some other ways to think about that and to research doing online education in the Christian space. Chapter 7, this was Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Christo Ecclesial Unity in Christian Higher Education. It's hard to get my tongue around that at midnight here in Toronto. But this chapter investigated how Christian higher education providers might follow after and attest to Christ in a shared commitment to Christocentric unity, both between and within our own institutions, which drew on the theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Chapter 8, Joseph Leppard was looking at Straussian grounded theory and putting that together with biblical narrative perspectives. And that came from his own research. Is basically the methodology for his study. So it was wonderful to see a methods chapter in our book. In chapter 9, developing a research and scholarship framework on Australian Christian higher education study, Denise Austin and David Perry presented us with how you might grapple with these terms, research and scholarship, and particularly how you might think about that in the Christian space, given all the competing demands that there are in higher education and in tertiary education, and the way those terms have been sort of inhabited and used in particular ways. And I think they're going to talk about that a little bit later on. In chapter 10, Christian Education, a frog in the kettle or a light on the hill, Craig Murison took on neoliberal story of education here and talked about the risks for Christian higher education if we buy into that instead of thinking about the story of human flourishing and human personhood that we see in our scriptures and in our tradition. In chapter 11, Jacqueline Greentree, also an Achia, an Achia member of staff and faculty, continued this theme about how does the Christian school understand itself in the neoliberal marketplace. And again, I think this is actually from Jacqueline's own research work. So it was great to see that published in our book. In chapter 12, James, I never know how to say James's surname correctly, so I apologize, James, if you're listening in, but James DL took on pluralism and Christian education as a case study, looking at how the rise of a new sexual fundamentalism has kind of put Christian education under the microscope in the name of tolerance and sexuality and freedom of religion. In chapter 13, David Benson, who was one of our keynote speakers at the Achia Symposium, gave us this piece, A Reason for Revelation, the place of sacred texts in secular middle school science curriculum, which I also believe comes from a major piece of research that he's been doing on how we might understand that kind of artificial religion-faith divide and think about revelation and reason in kind of more integrated ways within Christian curriculum. In chapter 14, Suanna Gowan and Maureen Minna-Bridges brought us some research that they've been doing at Excelsior College as a case study of the student experience. And again, this was one of the papers that won an award at the symposium, so it's wonderful to have it in our book, and they'll be sharing a little bit about that later on this afternoon.
Yeah, it's not about.
Chapter 15, I'm racing through them, but but they're all wonderful, I should say. In chapter 15, Sarah Tucker and Johannes Lutz presented together this piece, which I think comes from Sarah's work on art therapy and prison chaplaincy. And I should say that Sarah's paper won a prize at the Achia Symposium as well. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit about that, I think. She presented some analysis in this chapter from her own experience of developing and implementing an art therapy program in Queensland prisons, and it was an outstanding paper. In chapter 16, Andrew Butcher and Beverly Norsworthy collaborated on Cupbearers to the King, Humility, Hope and Hospitality for Formational Practice. Another case study from Christian higher education, this time Bethlehem Tertiary Institute, looking at how some work they had done on the books of Nehemiah and 1 Peter in relation to the formation of their own staff at the college. In chapter 17, Hugh Kemp gave us the Imaginarium of narrative in Christian curriculum design, another case study from St. Kenturgan College in Auckland. What Hugh Kemp did in this chapter is talk about some work that he had implemented around new content and relevant pedagogy. Narrative is a very prominent way in our postmodern context of understanding meaning, and he conceptualized 3 intertwined narratives: the students, the institutions, the historical with the biblical, and gave us some insights from lessons that he taught with year 9, 11 and 12. In chapter 18, Christine Chapman wrote about the training requirements for entry-level ministry-ready Pentecostal leaders. And what she's doing in this chapter is exploring whether the leadership training we're getting really matches the equipping of leaders in the context of the international network of churches in Australia. So that again is a qualitative case study of practice and approaches. In chapter 19, Daniel Patterson gave us Faith, Facts and Feeling, Christian Persuasion in Our Post-Secular Age, exploring avenues for communicating the Christian story in the midst of the questions and the challenges that we're experiencing in this cultural moment. And those questions have multiplied, haven't they, in the experience of global pandemic. Chapter 20, Towards an Embodied Pedagogy in Educating for Creation Care. That's by Graham Buxton, Johannes, Lutz and Sally Shaw. And addressing the need for educational strategies to increase our awareness of and our active participation in creation care initiatives, given the environmental challenges that we are now facing in the modern world. In chapter 21, Julie Robinson, Nicole Sterling, and Sharon Baronedesi presented a mixed methods case study outlining the inception, development, implementation, and outcomes of a youth education program that engages students in conversations about abortion issues. In chapter 22, this is a chapter called The Impact. Oh, I've got a different list. To you, Johannes. I've got them in a different order. I apologize. Yeah, no, go back. I'm just needing to catch up with my notes. Sorry. So, Towards Intercultural Literacy, a literature review of immersive cross-cultural experiences and intercultural competency by Wendy Nelson and Johannes Lutz. Johannes, it's missing from my list. So I wonder if you want to briefly summarize that chapter. I do apologize.
Yeah, no problem at all. So what the chapter does is look at immersive education, intercultural education. This was actually an interesting situation to face because the chapter was ready going in to production, and then COVID came and there was no longer the possibility for intercultural immersive experiences because nobody was flying anywhere anymore based on all flights having been grounded. And so it placed a particular challenge on Wendy Nelson, who is the research student in the Master of Social Science Leadership, who was conducting the study, who could all of a sudden no longer collect her data. And so what we ended up doing was integrating reflections into this chapter. How is intercultural immersive experience possible, or is it possible in a COVID-19 kind of a world? And so there was an interesting postscript that was added there at the end based on these very unique circumstances in the world. Back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Johannes. Thanks for helping me out there. But it was good to hear about the postscript. Chapter 23, Universal Design for Learning in Christian Higher Education, Inclusive Practices for Students with and Without Disability. So Louise Gospel explored universal design for learning as a framework for teaching and learning that gives all students equal access to education. And chapter 24, which I believe is the concluding chapter in the book, Sexual Addiction and Christian Education by Fakhri Sayed Aragami and Johannes Lutz. This was a really interesting chapter casting the spotlight on sexual addiction, hypersexual disorder. This is a phenomenon that the public remains poorly educated about. And the analysis in this chapter kind of confronts, I guess, Christian education stakeholders with the fact that we haven't talked about this issue enough. And it's a literature study, which the authors supplemented with some corresponding critical analysis, suggesting that religious and spiritual beliefs do strongly kind of impact recovery prospects. Johannes, that's a whistle-stop tour, as I said, through all of the chapters, but it just shows what rich treasures there are in this book. Yeah,
thank you very much, Beth.
Great. So we're up to part 2 now. We're going to hear from, we're actually very privileged to hear from four chapter authors. We're going to hear from Denise Austin in person, which is wonderful. And then on Zoom, we're going to have Mark Stevens, Maureen Miner, and Sarah Tucker. So Denise, if you want to come up and you can lead us off. by the way, before Denise starts, I just want to say there will be opportunity for questions later, but we'll hear from each of the authors and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. Thanks, Denise.
It's lovely to be here. I always feel like I'm coming home. I think CHC and City Point were my whole world for about 15 years, so it's always nice coming back and beautiful to see the renovations and what's been happening here. So thank you for having me here. David sends his apologies, he couldn't join us today. This is an excellent volume. Stephen told me how much it cost and sort of gasped, but it's really brilliant. And I think Johannes and Beth have done an outstanding job. So thank you for all your work. I often say it's just easier to write a book yourself. You know, it's much harder to edit a book. So thank you for all your hard work. So as Beth said, research and scholarship are difficult, seem to be difficult terms for people to talk about. And they're often used interchangeably. Likewise, like scholarship and teaching is also interchanged as though they're synonyms, but they're actually not, at least in the Australian context, with TEXA defining obviously research as the creation of new knowledge or looking at current knowledge in new and creative ways. And then scholarship is the dissemination of that knowledge. So TEXA, our Australian government body, really distinguishes between those, and all faculty have to do scholarship in Australia. We all have to do it. We need to be current in our field, and that's important because we want to be fresh for our students. We want to convey to our students that we are current in the knowledge of our field. But research itself is obviously a core requirement for university status. And as you probably know, Alpha Crucis is on that trajectory of wanting to become a university. So the challenge in Christian higher education is that we have no government funding for research. So the universities get all this money, we don't, but we have to meet that requirement, the same requirement for research if we want to be a university. So it's sort of a catch-22, and hence Christian education traditionally has focused on scholarship more than research. So a few years ago, I embarked on really a change management process at Alpha Crucis, and it's like trying to steer a ship in a different direction, just incrementally trying to move the faculty more towards high quality research. So this framework sort of came out of that change management process. So research is actually just one subset under scholarship. So it's just one component of scholarship. But what I was trying to think about is how does research engage with scholarship? And so trying, I guess, to help our faculty see the difference, but then also see the value of high quality research. So based on Boyer's model, Boyer's model of scholarship is discover, apply, impart or teach and integrate. And so we were thinking about, obviously, the end goal is impact and outcomes for our end users. That's what we all want, that, positive outcomes. So in terms of research, you start by exploring. You can't find new knowledge unless you start exploring. And then the scholarship part of that is to discover what you're exploring. This really involves leadership. So senior academic leadership, mentoring, particularly the junior faculty and HDR candidates. Johannes is particularly brilliant at this, is mentoring students, and actually one of your, or several of your students are in this book. So, that kind of thing, that senior faculty are encouraging and mentoring our students into publishing. So that's a really important component. Then influence is talking about having a voice. So when I was interviewing all of our faculty, a lot of times they're saying, well, we just want to get it out there. We just want it in, where it's easy and cheap to access, not $400. Let's get it in the soft copy, $30 book, then it's out there. I want to make an impact. But what I'm trying to say to people is, but if you publish in a high quality publication, then you have a voice in the discipline. You have an opportunity to actually change the field. And then after that, you can apply it to the broader community. So get your influence first, get your voice in the discipline, and then apply it and rewrite it in a popular publication, which is a lot easier than trying to do it the other way around. Then create internal structures to build a culture of scholarship and research within your organisation. So we have 7 research centres at AC. So, you know, just creating a place where people feel comfortable to research and then impart that, according to Boyer, in the classroom. So we create the vibrant research, which is what you're doing, and then impart it to the students. And then finally engage in inter-institutional and interdisciplinary study. So we collaborate and then integrate that into the communities of practice. So that's exactly what this book is doing. We are collaborating, we are cross-disciplinary, cross-institutional, which is a really important part of seeing positive outcomes. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Denise. We're now going to move on to one of the award-winning papers again, Mark Stevens, Thinking as Christian Virtue, Reason and Persuasion for a Fractious Age. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. I'll just confirm you guys can hear me.
Yep.
That's no trouble. Fantastic. Excellent. There's nothing like being introduced as an award-winning paper. But anyhow, let me summarize. Basically, the problem I was trying to address is that in 2018, there was a book brought out by an English professor in the United States, Alan Jacobs, and he wrote a book called How to Think. And it was a Christian humanities professor trying to help us all to think together and to together in far better ways in a fractious age. And Jacobs is a Christian, but he didn't make his book explicitly Christian. So I wanted to explore, could the resources of the Christian tradition actually help us to think better and to think in a virtuous fashion? But I actually wanted to go a little further than that. I wanted to ask the uncomfortable question whether Christian education actively works against virtuous thinking, whether many of the forms of Christian education actually help to produce arrogant or proud or inflexible thinkers. And so the first part of my paper was simply a summarization of what Jacobs had to say in that book, which isn't a long book. And it's really trying to ask, why is thinking so hard and why do we think so poorly at this present moment? There's a stack of reasons that he offers. The fact that our thinking interacts with the way that we want to belong to social tribes and groups. The fact that we often treat alternative viewpoints with disgust or inherent attraction rather than by pursuing careful thinking. And Jacobs' prescription throughout all of this is that we need to learn to ask hard questions of our thinking. Do we want to do the hard work of thinking, or do we prefer temporary comfort that comes from quick answers? Can we cultivate patience? Can we cultivate forbearance of other viewpoints? Or do we just slip straight into refutation mode? When I came to engage these problems as a Christian, I have an uncomfortable thought, and it may well be that Christian thinking might be part of the problem, that Christian education, particularly those of us who hold conservative Christian beliefs, which I do, it often produces people and thinkers whose patterns of thinking are defective in precisely the ways that Jacobs diagnoses. So we don't show patience with our opponents, or we are often driven not by thinking, but by feelings of revulsion and repugnance. And we aren't carefully questioning where we might be wrong. Indeed, I'll go further. We Christian educators often present the Christian worldview as the destroyer and the dominator of all alternative worldviews, so that every alternative is presented as idiotic and revolting. And this tends to produce truth tellers who are snarky, who are blind to their own faults, who are arrogant. And so we often speak in terms of our graduate attributes, in terms of forming Christ-like humility and love, grace towards the world, but it very well may be that our manner of inculcating truth might mitigate against the attainment of those attributes. And so can one practice what Richard Mouw calls convicted civility? What kinds of reflection and practice help in the formation of not only Christian thought, but Christ-like thinkers? And so I then go on to offer 3 possible sources for the Christian story and how it might resource better thinking. First, I use the discipline of virtue epistemology, which is a philosophical movement often appropriated by Christians, that argues not only for thinking logically and thinking with evidence, but that a good thinker needs to cultivate certain dispositions towards thinking. We don't just want the right answer, we want answers that are inherently careful, fair-minded, thorough, honest, courageous, humble. And we need to love the truth and love through our truth-telling, rather than just the desire to win arguments. Secondly, I look at the Christian ethic of hospitality, which encourages us to love the stranger, but I want to propose an intellectual slant on that, to love the stranger with their strange ideas. And so we can have people at our table who are different to us, and we can still love them, we can still welcome them, we can do that all without having to agree with them, because hospitality means listening, but listening does not necessarily mean affirmation. And third, I point to the fact that the very phenomenon of Scripture, which speaks in diverse genres, and it's a big book, which takes a long time to learn, encourages us, the applied reader is one who is careful, who has to constantly revise what they may have first thought, and needs to patiently take the time to listen and listen again as they grow in wisdom. So in the end, what I want is for Christians to love thinking, not just love what thinking can do for us, and to love through thinking. I want Christians to care about the manner of our thinking, to practice intellectual hospitality, to welcome strangers to the table of conversation. I want us to be honest about the way that we might be driven by repugnance rather than careful thought in the way that we evaluate others. And I want to promote Christian educational institutions which commend students not just for their conclusions, but for their manner of thinking. So what would it mean to actually honour thinkers who exemplify bravery and courage in their learning? What might it mean to encourage or commend people who show patience in their thinking, even if it means their final answers are not yet fully formed? And what might it mean ultimately to produce virtuous thinkers for a fractious age? Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for both Denise and Mark. And now we're going to hand over to Maureen Miner, who's going to speak on her chapter, Distinctively Christian Higher Education as the Holistic Formation of Students. Thanks, Maureen.
Okay, thank you. I'm presenting this paper on my own behalf and of my co-author, Sunana Gowan, who can't be here, unfortunately. I did have some slides, being a social scientist, there it is. So on the next slide, we can see basically the thesis of the chapter, which is that what is, I'm trying to get into my full screen mode, it's not working. Okay, what is distinctive about Christian education is the holistic development of students. And we realize that when we're thinking about holistic development, it might seem pretty straightforward with Christian domestic students, but everything seemed to go pear-shaped when we had an influx of international students. So in the next slide, we can see that, and again, I'm not viewing this very well. I might go out of this and go to my own set of slides, which are a little bit bigger. So what we can see is that holistic student formation involves attention to all the dimensions of student experience and identity formation, that is professional, personal, and spiritual. But beyond that, the integration of all those dimensions. It's not a final thing, but it's a progressive integration. On the next slide, the research question for us then, given a very brief introduction, how do staff at Ecclesial College understand student formation in that context of pluralism of our international students? What we did, you can see in the next slide, a qualitative study interviewing 10 academic staff members, asking about the reasons for joining Ecclesial College, what were their goals, and how did they try to go about student formation. And we used thematic analysis as our method. Our findings then in the next slide, fairly obviously, I suppose, that permanent staff joined the college because of its Christian worldview, and they wanted the opportunity to speak about Christian matters. As well as that, they endorse holistic student formation. And by this, they're looking at personal and spiritual formation within an integrative cognitive framework. We might see that in the next slide with the quote from Stephanie, where we can see there is both the kind of academic thinking in the professional mode, the self-development personal mode, self-reflection, but all of this is within an overall cognitive framework that's both theoretical, but then it results in action, their professional practice. Now, a comment on these findings then, certainly staff, in the next slide, these staff goals and values correspond to a systemic model of Christian higher education. And this is where the whole college is immersed in a Christian values system. So the vision, the mission, the ethos of the college and staff would be Christian. The Christian worldview permeates curriculum, and very often there are experiences of Christian worship and service aspects as well. However, we go to the next slide. There is really there is a problem of that Christian imbued ethos when we do get our students from many other cultures and religions. And in fact, the staff pointed to a number of challenges they faced with students from other cultures, many relating to student adjustment, but also, as you can see in the quote, that there are mental health issues very often stemming from issues in the student's country of origin and being exacerbated by or coming out in experiences here in Australia. So how does staff deal with that? We go to the next slide, we see that some staff go to a secular model, and this can be lifelong learning, social capital, more or less a secular, it's a secular perspective. In the next slide, we can see that some work within a systemic model that has the strong Christian influence. So even though there might be Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist students in the classroom, they try to immerse the class within the Christian ethos. And here we have a respondent who will pray, do devotions in the classroom, and simply observe that a Muslim student believes in the same God. In the next slide, we can see that some will go to what we call the umbrella model, where there's a diversity of perspectives within an overall Christian framework, but nonetheless, the dominating feature of this is it's non-sectarian. So a pluralistic set of worldviews would be recognised. And we can see in the quote there that some staff members acknowledge or see that kind of a perspective as important. So our conclusion, which I have very briefly in the final slide, is that there's no consensus amongst the staff. But if we are going to operate in Christian higher education within a pluralistic context where we have many international students, then I think we need a shared model, not 3 or 4 different models amongst staff. We need to have a shared model of holistic formation within that pluralistic context. And in the little table here, which isn't part of the book, but which, or the book chapter, sorry, but which is implied in it, and which I think is the most interesting part for future work and discussion, is how do we get the whole ethos of a college? How do we get curricula? How do we get pedagogy? How do we get the extracurricular activities and relationships all part of, directed towards the holistic formation of all our students? And I think one way of doing that is to be thinking, how do we integrate professional, personal, and spiritual development of students, acknowledging that spiritual development for students of other faiths will be similar in form and structure, perhaps, to formation of Christian students, but different in content. How do we encourage holistic formation of students? If we can agree on outcomes, we acknowledge what students come in with, what's their base level in these areas, we can begin to look at strategies and means. So really, this chapter is looking at a challenge faced by Excelsior College with the influx of international students, the lack of consensus, and maybe pointing to a need for much more dialogue and research if we're to have a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Another stimulating paper summary there. But before we take any questions, we're going to hear from Sarah Tucker, Art Therapy and Prison Chaplaincy, a review of contemporary practices considering New Testament teachings. So over to you, Sarah.
Next slide, please, Johannes. Thank you. And next one. So despite 2020 prisoner populations decreasing 5% by early COVID prisoner releases, they have already respiked, showing the problems associated with unplanned releases alongside a pandemic with limited community resources. Currently, Australia's prison population is at roughly 42,500, over 100 operating prisons in Australia alone. There are over 15 prison expansions and new building projects advancing Australia-wide, which when filled will increase the prisoner population from 42 to 43,000 to potentially 50 to 60,000 projected in the next 4 to 5 years, which is relevant to social conditions. Next slide, please. The demographic of Australian prisons is largely concentrated of Indigenous, which populate a disgraceful 28% of the national total. Current prison architecture structure was designed alongside traditional zoo architecture after the advancement of the British colony to exotic locations, also the time of penal colonisation and the Transportation Act of prisoners away from Britain's shores. Prisons, just like zoos, force animals into unnatural environments, reducing their survival rate. Prisons force humans into environments which are culturally unnatural, environmentally sterile and relationally unnatural, and create a genetic imprint upon entire families, causing additional stresses upon the central nervous system and psyche. Prisons strip away personal identity, control, and individuality. Next slide, please. Prisons are not only architectural and spiritual blemishes on the planet, but are costly to the community financially as well as socially. How do governments justify such extenuating costs and deductions from the taxpayers' pockets? The media. Whether social or controlled, media defines the boundaries of a perceived problem by shaping and influencing subconscious parameters through propaganda, manufactured within the collective conscious. Fear becomes the tool of necessity upon which policy stands. Perhaps these numbers give off an air of comfort, but when the cost of housing a prisoner per day currently stands at $320, with no assurance of rehabilitation, the money is no comfort when the rehabilitation methods fall short and you become a victim. The weight of comfort seen in dollar signs must be reassessed. The media holds too much power in a country associated with democracy, and pragmatic vision is required to negotiate the truths from the disinformation prevalent. A reconsideration of personal safety values is essential for the progression of communal healing and reconciliation. Next slide, please. 1/3 of Australian prisoners have an education of year 10 or lower. Therefore, literacy is a challenge for most inmates, and reading dense scripture in historically traditional language becomes impossible to decipher for its true and inherent meaning. As a result, the small print Bibles with fine paper being handed out by chaplains make valuable tobacco rolling utensils, and it is well known amongst prison staff that most prisoners smoke Leviticus or Deuteronomy. An additional current problem are the sins of the past highlighted by the National Redress Scheme for the victims of child abuse within church bodies. With so many prisoners having been left vulnerable to trauma and abuse, proselytization or direct conversion is discouraged. 3 out of 4 prisoners have previously been incarcerated, and 54% of dischargees expect to be homeless upon release. This highlights a large gap in community services. We are directly instructed and obliged to follow Jesus in the places that he tread. Hebrews 13:3. Remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourself were suffering. Australian prison chaplaincy services are managed differently state to state. Queensland chaplains are voluntary, and the prison ministry runs largely off fundraising and donations, which makes finding volunteer chaplains who are motivated by altruistic endeavours and able to pass police checks and security checks problematic, and impossible for people with lived experiences that can be relatable to the inmates. Visual interactions can break down generational and social divisions without judgment or presumption. With an understanding of art basics, art can become a therapeutic alliance for inmates to explore their own identities within Christ. Art can not only disciple, but teach perspectives and emotions previously unexplored or experienced by the social exclusion cycle that incarceration creates. Next slide, please. Humans have communicated through history with visual imagery. Art and literacy is a fundamental right as a spiritual direction in communication. Prison chaplaincy is not only documented from the time of Jesus' ministry, but is a fundamental right. The Bible speaks directly about prisoners and slaves. Despite all the apostles and Jesus being imprisoned, it is also an out of sight, out of mind ministry. The significant importance of prison chaplaincy for prisoners extends beyond the internal hell that modern prisons are. Creating a connect with an external member of the public creates glimmers of hope that breaks the walls of silence and formulates a memory of compassion. The term penitentiary has etymological linings with to give penance, to reflect upon one deed. Yet left in solitary confinement, these notions are lost in the void, and the majority of prisoners are absent of a moral compass. Penance once again becomes a distant goal of attainment. Historically, spreading the gospel was broad in methodology. Socrates was literal and went without recording any of his own words to convey more depth. Women were not permitted to read the canons with the Catholic Church and were only taught through spoken word. Therefore, visual imagery within the cathedral became educator. The biblical stories have been visually recreated for alternate cultures for each age over and over. Next slides, please. Additionally, God as creator communicates in the language of creativity and artistic endeavor. By creating a visually rich and abundant work, we as disciples of Christ experience the next ideals from the creation story within our imaginations. Next lot of slides, please. And where Jesus leaves us to follow at the crucifixion, others dare not tread. A picture can speak 1,000 words and can bridge a divisive gap in cultures, society, and communities, and creates a powerful symbol for the oppressed. Art, along with its dimensional language, can create movements and motivate people towards personal freedoms in alternate mediums. Art therapy, despite its proven, researched, and recorded therapeutic results, is still under-researched within Australian contexts. And problematic to its administration within prisons is the lack of public awareness regarding life behind bars or how to work with prisoners, specifically with the staff and prisons. Created from the remnants of a cram-packed life, the Change the Design of Your Life with Uniting Care program was created to assist a high public demand for cost reduction while achieving community safety. The first programs to be cut in prison budgets are holistic alternatives. It is these reasons that this program is run entirely via personal fundraising and the Uniting Care Prison Ministry. Research shows that minimal intervention for offender rehabilitation is most successful at 60 to 80 hours. A minimal neural requirement for promoting cognitive change. The CDL program covers this much time, and by introducing very simplistic and basic forms of visual expression early in the program, the expectation for producing highly valuable artwork is diminished through the highlighting of personal expression and self-autobiographical stories. When inmates are given an alternate focus during therapy, they are usually hindered to explore their own self and internal freedoms. Using art therapy techniques are aligned with neuroscience. The CDL program works within the inmate's place of need, the place in which they are screaming to be heard. Next slide, please. Simple art techniques, and next slide, sorry, can allow the subconscious to rise above the conformity of prison rules, both written and unwritten. The visual process of identifying words, shapes, and colors can give birth to new, insightful conscious awareness. Next slide. To date, 5 iterations of the CDL pilot program have been facilitated and currently awaiting QCS final approval to begin data collation for evidence. Additionally, God as creator communicates in the language of creativity and artistic endeavor and encourages us as creations and disciples to follow suit. Last slide. And from the words of Banksy, outside is where art should live, amongst us, where it can act as a public service, provoke debate, voice concerns, and forge identities. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're moving on to time now of questions. So I'm going to open up to all of you and to those of you on Zoom as well. If you want to interact with any of the speakers, you are free to do so now. It might be a little bit hard for people on Zoom to hear people in this room, so I'll repeat the question if someone asks from here, and we can go from there. So if anyone has any questions for any of the speakers at this point, fire away. Yeah, Deb.
I'd really like to ask Maureen.
Yeah.
That was a really fascinating presentation, Maureen. I loved it. I'd love to ask, how do you suggest you would explore a shared model with your staff? And how do we include professional, personal and spiritual formation for all our students? They were the 2 questions you were proposing. What have you suggested to your organisation to move forward as a result of those questions?
I don't know whether you could hear that, Maureen. Could you? No.
No, sorry.
Deb Ailing loved your paper, thought it was great, and that's a summary of her compliments to you. And then she asked. She asked what you've suggested to your organisation in terms of moving forward with that shared model idea. And the second part, Deb, was, that's fine, yeah. So what have you kind of prescribed, I guess, or suggested for Excelsior?
Okay, it's not so much what I have tried to describe and push. It's more getting the CEO, getting other academic staff and admin staff as well to be discussing these things. And the way we can come to the shared understanding is not, I think, top down. It's the breadth of discussion and debate about it, guided by the overarching value and mission of Excelsior College. So we are basically starting with the systemic model, but in the face of pluralism, what we need to do is move to something that I've described as the holistic model. And in order to do that, it's a matter of just reflecting on the day-to-day difficulties with our international students, the experiences, the pedagogies, etc. But we do have avenues for that in fortnightly community meetings where we can get together, the whole staff can get together, and there can be brief snippets that can help encourage this discussion and debate. Then it's a matter of bringing it through the different committees. So bringing these items onto the agendas of a learning and teaching committee, a research committee, bringing it up to academic board and committee of management, etc. So I think it starts with the basic discussion, but then intentionally moving it into the various committees so that we can be not just discussing what might be needed, but also what resources do we need to be able to go in these directions.
That's helpful, yeah, thank you. That's great. Is there anyone in Zoom land who wants to ask a question? Maybe I'll rotate through. Anyone in Zoom land? Just sing out.
Oh, can I just make a comment?
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, yeah. I've been very impressed by the volume and the transformative wisdom that actually flows through the chapters, and hearing this afternoon, focus on placemaking and arts therapy, participation. All of these seem to me to be central themes, which I know Johannes and I and Sally have written about in our chapter. And I actually believe that in the broader sense, all education has an ultimate goal to enable us to live fully human lives. And I just wondered how presenters and others might want to respond to that, in the sense that we are called to enter into activities which enable us to become more fully human in the richest possible way.
Good question. I might dob someone in if that's all right, just to save any awkward silences.
I would just want to add that in fact,
oh, yeah, you go, and then I'll ask Mark Stevens what he thinks. But go for it, Graham. Yeah.
My own conviction is that often we have been divorced from physicality and connection with creation, and that prevents us and holds us back from actually becoming more fully human. I think that's a whole dimension of life that many people simply miss out on and don't understand in terms of what it really means to be fully and completely human as God intends us to be.
Yeah. I'm just going to dob in Mark.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, thanks.
No trouble. Absolutely. The task of a disciple is not simply to become some narrow vision of piety and spiritual, but to actually fulfill one's image-bearing function from the very beginning of the creation narrative, which is not just simply in religious spaces. So in terms of my own contribution, I can only speak to, in terms of thinking, the desire of thinking is not to remove thinking into the kind of abstractions that we often do, but to actually energize the conversations that we have and the thinking that happens in every embodied space and every face-to-face interaction that we have that we're constantly doing. And to that end, I'm just about to finish up writing a little 50, 60-page book that's intended for all people, not just for Christians, about how we might think better. But I'm not talking about the classroom. I'm talking about the cafe. I'm talking about the conversation with your daughter. I'm talking about the ways we think about anything, whether it's voting, whether we should go to the beach, whether it's whatever. So absolutely, I'm wholeheartedly in support of what you're suggesting.
Great, thanks, Graham. Thanks, Mark. From the live audience here. I know you're all alive, but the people who are here with me. Another one from Deb, go for it. Yeah, great. Mark, this is for you, so I'll repeat it in a second.
Mark, thoroughly fascinated with what you shared and the controversial transparency that you spoke of. And what I'd like to ask, what are you doing practically as, I'm assuming, an educator to develop virtuous thinkers now? Now, if you propose this problem, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Give us a clue what you're doing for action.
All right, so this question's for Mark. And again, Mark, you'll be pleased to know that Deb loved the paper in the chapter. So thumbs up again from Deb. Her question was, given you've proposed, I guess, this new paradigm for thinkers and for interacting with other ways of thinking, what are you doing in your context, your educational context, to implement this model or this way of thinking?
Yeah, well, what I did is I fled the educational context and joined a think tank so that I had to avoid such questions. What do I do in the limited amounts that I do in education still? Is first of all, create structures where there is an encouragement to engage with the other. So to tell my students that my grading scales reflect that, but furthermore, to actually encourage perspective taking. So Tim Muehlhoff is very good in this space, if you're not familiar with his work. But the notion of being able to dwell with someone else's perspective and to not render judgment immediately. Furthermore, I think to model to my students humility and hospitality. So it's very important to my students that they know I get things wrong, and for those students to know that I will hear their voice. There's a set of practices in terms of the way I structure conversation in the room. I often try and survey my students to work out their belief systems and then deliberately set them up to try and have engagement so that they're not doing like for like, and also to create assessment structures and ways of learning that will get them engaging with strangers.
Great, thank you, Mark. Yeah, very good. Zoom, anyone in Zoom land who wants to make a comment or ask a question? All right, you've got 5 seconds and I'm going live again. Anyone? No? I've got a question for Denise, actually. Denise, one of the challenges in Christian higher ed, probably in Australia and probably everywhere in the world, is in implementing a focus on research and scholarship is resources, right? So there's, as you said, public universities have a lot of resourcing thrown at research, but it's harder for institutions, typically in the Christian sector, to do that. Is there not necessarily the model that you talked about helping with this, but is there a way, do you think, that institutions can structure their research and scholarship in such a way to kind of make that an efficient thing, do you think? Do you want to come up? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Resources is always going to be the problem. We all have a limited amount of time and we're all stretched with our teaching loads, etc. I guess I'm of the view that research doesn't have to cost as much money as everybody is saying. So what I'm implementing at AC is, for example, grants, and actually CHC Craig is part of that as well. And so we're giving grants, and CHC and AC have partnered in a grant situation there. And that is encouraging part-timers who need actual funding. So they're doing research for us. The candidates are already doing research, so that's low-hanging fruit. They already have to do that research, so let's get them publishing it. So I guess there's different ways that I'm thinking that we can get publications up without having to spend a whole lot of money. But in terms of full-time faculty, yeah, I understand that's a challenge. But I guess I'm looking at particularly the younger people on a promotion track, older people who are well established and they're full-time teachers and that's what they love doing, that's great. But younger people who want to progress into senior leadership and have a promotion goal, they're super engaged and they'll probably work on the weekends.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, thanks. All right, now any other questions?
It's not a question, but I'd like to make a comment if I may.
Great, go for it.
Cool. One of the other sources of income for research is being really observant for opportunities that come from other places. So here in New Zealand, we have a government research arm, if you like, and they welcome projects. And so I'm just going to show you if I can. If you went to Aotearoa in New Zealand, the very first picture that comes up will be something that was done by 3 Christian tertiary providers working together around the student evaluation of teaching. And, you know, that's a national voice. I like the idea that Denise made about influencing and applying. And that one's a really good example. So encouraging people to not be shy in applying for grants from government or other bodies.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Bev. Yeah. Other questions? If there's no more, so just checking, last chance. No, there's no more. That's been a really good time of interaction, and there's more to talk about, of course. But I'm going to throw now back to Beth, who's still with us and still awake, I think. It's past 1 o'clock there now, so well done, Beth. You're doing great. But over to you to sum up and reflect on the book.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really loved the taster that we had there from our different chapter authors, and I think what I just want to share with you a couple of things I scribbled down when I was listening to your presentations. One of the things that I wrote down was widening the story about what education is for. And Graham, that very much connects with your questions and your comments. And I wrote it during Sarah's presentation, actually, thinking about the place of art therapy in the prison system and getting, that took us beyond the schoolhouse, and it took us beyond the kind of classroom space. And I also scribbled down the sort of ways in which
He's being sensitive. Is everyone? Is it? Oh no, Graham's still going. So it's just Beth. Try and talk to Beth.
Try and put something in the chat. Oh, she's gone. Yeah, she's not on here. I don't know if Beth is still with us. I don't think that's the case now. Here we are. We're having to improvise. What can we do? Yeah, I could never undertake to summarize what Beth has prepared to summarize for us. But I mean, I can share my parts at the end that lead to the launching of the book, perhaps, and perhaps Beth may join us again. She may be able to come back on. So a few thoughts that I had scribbled down just in sort of closing this book launch have to do with the title of the book, Innovating Christian Education Research. This is a title that came out of our discussions with the publishers, and we were convinced that this was a good way to frame the chapters along the idea of a verb, innovating. So rather than innovative, something that has already been attained, we thought innovating, an action verb, was more what we thought we would aim for. And so that communicates the idea that we're not there yet, but we're aiming to innovate Christian education research with these multidisciplinary perspectives, encapsulating a broad universe of contributions. The other closing thought I had was that it took us probably about 2.5 years from the time we first were discussing with the publishers until the book was finally posted out to us. So plenty of patience there required of us, and also the authors. And so my gratitude goes to all the authors, really. And this is a note of thanks that I am wishing to express to all of you authors, both the ones represented here in this room and the ones represented there on this Zoom call, just to really express my thanks and gratitude for what you have contributed to this great volume. Listening to some of the speakers here today again made me just remember what a wonderful collection of different contributions we have, and many of them actually make really wonderful readings for our unit here. I've got a number of chapters earmarked for different units where I think they would just make a wonderful required reading, not just recommended reading. I think they're actually sort of essential reading for many of our units. And so a note of thanks to all of you authors. on that note, I see Beth is back with us again. So perhaps back to you, Beth. Are you up for it? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
quarter after 1 in your part of the world.
I was just thinking about the irony that I was talking about disruption and then I lost my Zoom connection. So I'm going to start somewhere else because I've lost the thread of what I was saying before. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the contribution that I think this book makes to the field of Christian education. Christian education and research and scholarship. I want to make sure I keep those distinctions separate and clearly defined, thanks to Denise's chapter. But it's both an old and a young field, isn't it? The roots of our institutions of education and learning lie historically in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also in terms of kind of publishing and doing empirical research. We're a very young field. Some of you may know that I also edit for the International Journal of Christian Education, which is one of the sort of ways in which I'm trying to encourage growth and dissemination of research and publication in the field of Christian education. And that journal came out of an Australian journal, actually, the Journal of Christian Education, which was founded in Australia in 1958, and it merged with the Journal of Christian Education and Belief, which came out of the UK. And so I'm interested in this kind of tradition that you guys have in Australia of not just setting up a Christian school system and investing in Christian education, both in the K-12 space and the higher education space, but also beginning to reflect on it and to do research in it. And sometimes you kind of need to do and then pause and then think and then write. And I think that's kind of the pattern, and that's kind of where we're at the moment. And one of the things that's really important as we grow and develop our own self-understanding and our own faithfulness, I think, to the vocation that God has given us as educators, whether that's in formal spaces or whether that's in informal education spaces. And I was talking before I dropped off the internet about how we widen the story about what education is for. As we have those kinds of conversations, there's a certain amount of gatekeeping, I think, that needs to happen. And certainly, and what I mean by that is kind of reflecting on the underlying philosophy, the theories that we're working with. So thinking about how we think, to follow the theme from Mark's chapter. We also need really kind of practical examples and case studies of what people have actually been doing within their own institutional spaces and within their own institutional practice. And we need, so that reminds me, sorry, before I move on, of Bev's 2 chapters actually in this book and some of the others which are really rooted in case study work. And then we also need the empirical research that sets up questions and that says, how do we develop new models and ways of doing things, which is the kind of example we had from Maureen's chapter. And you might have noticed that the book's organized that way. So section 1 is a collection of chapters which reflect on theory, which reflect on the sort of underlying philosophical and theological categories that we might want to work with and think with. And section 2 is very much kind of practice, case studies pieces in the book. And then the 3rd section are those studies that have begun to imagine how we might do research in Christian education in new ways and new spaces. And I think that we're offering that as a, yes, we've gathered together this work in this volume, but it's also meant to be, as I say, to encourage other people to do the same, to gatekeep the field a bit, to show what level of rigor is needed. That's why we had a very rigorous peer review process in this book, and also to help students get published and to see, you know, what it's like to be part of that process. So I think I'm proud of that achievement in terms of the impact that I think this collection makes. Just to talk a little bit about the way that the chapters are grouped together, because I think this will illustrate my point a little further. One of the assets, I think, of the Judeo-Christian tradition upon which Christian education draws is this concept of wisdom. And wisdom is an embodied and an holistic way of knowing within community, and it's ordered towards right living. And when wisdom's personified in the ancient texts as, hardworking, rigorous, contemplative, dialogic, but also uncompromisingly committed to this bigger story about what is good, against which we should be weighing up our actions and our desires and our thoughts. We're also, as Christian educators, though, children of our own times. And some of the prominent writers in the field at the moment in Christian education, so I'm thinking about people like Jamie Smith, David Smith, they've called attention to some of the problematic ways in which we as Christian educators import assumptions from our own contemporary economic and political and scientific narratives without appropriate reflection and criticism, and the narrowing of education, the smaller story that we have been telling, I think, is an example of that. Education is just about a job, or it's just a machine to get accredited, and we haven't spent enough time thinking about what it means to develop rich notions of professionalism, professional practice, or what does it mean to use educational experiences to heal broken parts of our society, broken parts within us, and all of that's developed both in section 1, but also you'll hear the echoes in what I've just said of some of the chapters in later sections that really get into that in terms of the case study and the empirical research. In section 2, we're very much collected together the chapters that were really practice focused, and that was important to us because the wisdom tradition texts of the Bible place as much emphasis, if not more actually, on our practice as they do about the ways in which we think. And I think it's important to say that practical wisdom doesn't eschew conceptual knowledge, but it takes into account the way our practices can shape how we think. And so, having laid the sort of foundations in the theory section, it was a wonderful opportunity to look at the contributions of chapter authors. They stand in their own right, but also together, the collection offered really important examples for Christian educators who are interested in bringing this idea of formation and practice together. So we've got everything in there from Joseph's methodological chapter, like how you might design data collection. We've got analysis, reflection, and they're all about, in my view, all those chapters are about expanding learning, being and doing in real world educational settings. And I hope that that's inspirational for people who are already in the midst of developing projects and programs in Christian institutions of both higher education, but also in the K-12 setting. I have to confess, if I have a favorite section of the book, it's probably the chapters in the 3rd section, only because I kind of began my career in the field of Christian education in empirical research, and I wanted to find more people who were doing that when I was a doctoral student, and I'm always looking for people who've managed to find the resources that we were talking about earlier to get out and do empirical work in the field. And so when we think about doing research in the real world in relation to the practices of wisdom as we see them exemplified in the Christian tradition, I get more excited about research again when I do that, because the opportunity to think about how we design empirical work and how we pose questions and answer research questions and think about how our understandings formed in habits of heart, mind and action. Putting those two things together really, really interests me. And all the chapters in this section assume that human beings are bound in relationship both to God, the natural world, and to each other. And they reflect on this interdependence. And when I think about how research methods, courses, and the kind of more typical route into research that doctoral students are kind of encouraged into, it seems to me that those things are often missing. And I want to see empirical work that is really grounded in those questions of personhood, love, flourishing, relationship. And I think that we have lots of examples of how to do that really well in section 3 of the book. And so what I'm hoping is that together this collection will expand our imagination of what Christian education is for, how it can meet the needs in our contemporary culture and society, how it can itself be a disruptor rather than just disrupted, and how it can inspire virtuous conversations, offer hospitality, and enable us to live fully the life of mind and body that we were created for. Johannes, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beth, for leading us in these reflections on the contribution of the book. I have already begun to thank all the authors while you had been disconnected there momentarily, Beth. And so my next note of thanks also goes to the anonymous peer reviewers who gave so generously of their time. They are the group of people who are often forgotten in this whole process, and it is such an important part of community service. And we can't even acknowledge and thank them individually by name because they are anonymous. So my note of thanks goes to all those peer reviewers who gave input to make the book what it ended up becoming. So in closing this part of the book launch, I think I'd like to just read the last 2 sentences from the introduction, which I have printed out. And this is what the introduction says: with a lineup of 23 chapters as rich in novelty, diversity, relevancy, and originality as you are now holding in your hands, or as I am now holding in my hands, and with 3 diverse parts promising a broad range of conceptual, empirical, and practice-informed research dimensions, it is our joy and privilege to present to you Innovating Christian Education Research, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. We hope, Beth and I hope, we hope as the editors that you will enjoy a delightful and perhaps even delectable time of reading, rumination, reflection, inspiration, imagination, and most importantly, research motivation to keep innovating. And so on that happy note, it is my joy and privilege to declare this book launched. And we do have a copy in the library. Our own friendly librarian, Stephen Morton, is just holding it up here. And we've got several digital licenses as well. So if any of the chapters that were presented here today, either in a more in-depth manner or in a cursory fashion, have been of interest to you, you now know where to go and get those. So thank you again to you, the authors, and everybody who had involvement with the book. And the book is launched, yay.
Well, thanks to Beth, to Johannes, to Denise, Maureen, Mark, and Sarah for presenting and speaking today. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Azosa for setting up all the food, and you can smell the pizza. Sorry, guys, you missed out. But this is a real achievement for all of you. So congratulations, and let's give everyone a big hand again, everyone who's involved. Well done. We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
We might have some. We've got some staff meeting stuff we're going to do before we do pizza. I think. Great.
All right, yeah. Yeah, this is now moved to a more informal part of the faculty meeting. A new faculty member is being introduced in the background. So I'll just keep this open for a few more minutes in case any of you want to put anything in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for being with us today, joining us on this book launch. It's been wonderful to have you join virtually, and no doubt we'll be in touch. And I wish you could join us in the COVID-safe nibbles that we're going to enjoy. But
Thanks, Johannes. Cheers. Okay.
bye.
We'll start off with one but please do not touch these. This is a COVID-free thing. So send touch your hands first and then stay in line and I'll put one on the plate that you like, eat it and come back and eat it. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for hosting. That's great.
First paper is trying to start getting ready there. It'll be the research questions. And I still appreciate because he's saying panel meeting. He's going to do it on the judgment seat of Christ. He said he's reading. He just hasn't done as much repenting in the last year. Reading, I said, Fiona, if you have to make it out. So, well, this is what I was thinking. I really like the idea of supernatural strategic leadership. I've done enough research on transformational leadership in my master's. I'm really looking for practical thinking. I really like it. And say Joseph, Daniel, they have 10 times smarter than their mates. Spirit of God, and the sons of Issachar saying, really fascinating.